on the Teams. You're muted on the Teams.
Now, 10 seconds. Let's wait for 10 seconds.
Also muted, so that's fine.
Is that better?
Yes.
Should be.
Should be. Okay, let us know.
Better. Is that better? Yeah. Well, we are fixing the mic, the audio thing. What about we have Andrea introduce herself? Yeah, it's working now. Perfect. Okay. So just leave it like this. I'm not touching it.
Okay, we're leaving it there.
I'm not touching it.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Jiang. I'm Andrea Lau. I'm from a company called Small Multiples. And we're just a small company of 2 at the moment, but we used to be 15, and we decided that you'll hear the story. And I'm here today to talk specifically about building data visualization tools, which I'll again explain in a second. Sorry guys, I can hear your chatter. And look at specific industry case studies. So I'll talk to you briefly about the background. So I did a design computing degree at the University of Sydney, which is this really weird hybrid degree where we took some School of IT subjects, we had art-based subjects, and then we had these design studios that we would do every semester. And they were design-based problems where at the beginning we would get a client and a problem to solve. We would work all the way through, which meant we would have to do research and user testing and prototyping. We would have to do our own design work. We would often work in groups as well. So it was the perfect way to learn that design process, which was really interesting. At the same time, Jack Zhao, who's the other half of Small Multiples and also my partner, he was here doing a bioinformatics degree as his first degree. But when he graduated, he felt like he wanted something a bit different. So he decided to do a Masters of Interaction Design and Electronic Arts at Sydney Uni. So we overlapped at that stage where our supervisor managed to convince both of us to do a research degree. So I started a PhD, and goodness, PhDs are hard. I did 1 year and decided that I didn't want to do it anymore. Jack did 1 year of an MPhil, which is a 2-year kind of a mini version of a PhD. Also difficult though. And he decided after that year to also finish up. But it was lucky that we met at that time because now we've been together for 17 years. We have a 7-year-old, we have a 13-year business together. So it was very, very lucky that we met at that point. So we've been running Small Multiples for 13 years, but we've been in industry for about 15 or so. And we also tried consulting for a year. A couple of years ago, we joined Accenture, the same team, the innovation team, for a year apiece, but we decided that maybe wasn't for us, and I can talk to you about that if you like. One of the things you have to know about me is I don't call myself an engineer. I can code, and I think I'm fairly okay at it, but I've never learned it really properly, formally, like you are learning it. Like I said, we did School of IT subjects back in the day, but that was kind of it. I would like to call myself a data visualization expert, but that doesn't fit on a card when you come back into Australia, when you do your re-entry. So at the end of the day, I call myself a designer. So don't hold it against me that I'm calling myself a designer and giving you a lecture, even though you're software engineering students and other various students. The perspective here is quite multidisciplinary. So you'll see a lot of data work. You'll see a lot of user requirements work, and also engineering of the web, mostly the web side of things, and making dashboards and things like that as well. So it's a bit of a hybrid, a bit of a multidisciplinary kind of approach. But hopefully that gives you this perspective where when you're out in industry, you're either that really strong, maybe developer, software engineer as part of a big group, and you need to know what the other people on your team are going to be like, or maybe you're going to turn out more multidisciplinary as well, and you're going to take on other roles. And I've got some tips and tricks for you at the end. So at Small Multiples, we have over the years developed a bit of a framework in order to figure out how we make data visualization. And I should probably explain to you what data visualization is. So data visualization is essentially making data useful to people in a way that's more insightful by using representation. So whether that be maps or charts or really basic ways of encoding one set of data to a visual. We take a very design-led approach where sometimes if you hear data visualization out in the world, people might be using it as a shortcut for Tableau or Power BI or other business intelligent tools. So you might hear it like that. We use those tools, but we tend to, like I said, focus on the entire process. And you'll see some of the examples as I show you through the case studies of what kind of the range of work that we do is. So in this framework, we have 3 parts, which often get left out in these kind of projects. One, which is purpose, which is around why you're making it, why the thing that you're, and then this applies to general projects as well. So why something exists, like what is the point of making something? Who you're making it for and why they need it. Once they look at it, what do they need to do afterwards? What actions do they need to take? Because if people aren't going to use it, then what's the point of making it? And then you've got obviously the data side of things for us, bringing all of these things together. And that ends up defining what, in this case, our data visualization projects happen to be.
Do you want to turn on your...
This one?
Yeah, I think...
Okay.
Yeah, maybe easy for you.
And let us know if there's like extra audio as well on that. Okay, all right. Let me just wipe this sniffle away. Okay. So like as a really basic thing, we do like these worksheets, which we kind of fill out during the very beginning of a project. I can still hear mumbling. Sorry, I'm just like, okay. So it's like this input-output thing. Like if I have to process input, I can't quite give you a good lecture, So usually what happens at the beginning of the project is that we ask questions to frame all of these things that we have in the framework. So one of the things is purpose. So we make sure that when we're going to a client, we ask them these things. It's like, well, who are you using? What is it? What is the name? Do you have a name for it? That's a good shortcut sometimes. Who is it for? Starting to think about the audience. What is it exactly? Because maybe your client has a thing in mind. Maybe it is an app. Maybe it is an IoT device platform. Maybe it is a dashboard. Sometimes they don't know what they want actually. So you always want to try and figure out what they want from there. You need to also know why something should exist and also what the outcomes are. So this is a really funny one, and I'll maybe talk about this later as well, which is that sometimes you might produce a thing like a dashboard or an app, but sometimes it's not the actual deliverable that is important to a client. Sometimes it's the fact that you've used some funding and they can show off to their bosses that they've used the funding and there's a cool thing. Or it might be that they've really enjoyed the process because it helps them to engage with a stakeholder in a way that they've never done before. And the fact that they happen to get something at the end is not actually important. So sometimes you need to really understand why you're doing the project, not just the thing that you're delivering, but what outcome it gets for your client. So there's purpose, there's also audience, and there are several levels of this, and you will probably already be a little bit, you'll know some of this already. So at the very basic level, we would make something called an audience statement. So we would go, and this would overlap with probably what you've already learned. In the back, you can still hear the mumbling. We would, at a very basic level, go, okay, who is the name of your target audience? Maybe there's a primary and a secondary, maybe there are a few more as well. What are they needing it for? So the idea is that you would hopefully give someone something where they, for example, sit down in the morning after a weekend and go, okay, how is X going? The CEO of a company might have it on her mobile phone and be checking constantly about something like numbers and making sure that she has the right kind of targets reached. So everyone needs an action to take, or they're looking for a particular thing in what you're making, and they're going to take it away and maybe show someone else, report it to someone else in the area of data visualization at least. And this obviously applies to when you're making things for people as well. They need to do something after they've used what you've made for them. And also you need to think about what's relevant to them, what kind of scenario they're in. You know, are they on their mobile? Are they in a rush? Are they sitting in front of their computer with lots of information? How much of an expert are they? All of these things. So at a very basic level, like I said, it might be something like an audience statement, which is just who are you making it for? What are their goals? What are their pains? And what do they need to get out of it? You could also go to the next level where you make something called an empathy map. Have you heard of an empathy map before? Some nods. So an empathy map being a bit more detailed. So sometimes so the audience statement, we often make either based on smart assumptions and a combination of us asking the client as a proxy, which means that, you know, the client usually kind of knows who their audience is and who they're making it for, and they can kind of tell you what they think their audience wants, and so that's what I mean by the client as a proxy to the audience. So that often happens, but if you have a little bit more budget and you have a little bit more time, then you can start talking to the actual audience, and that might be through just a meeting or two, or it might be some formalized interviews. Again, you know all of these things, or you should know all of these things already. So at the end of research, you might end up with an empathy map that gives you a more detailed idea of who the audience is. So this might be because you have a bit more of a budget, the project is a bit more complex, or it might be a little bit more higher stakes, so you kind of need proof of what you're doing. And then finally, there's proper user research where you're going and doing proper interviews, things from the Nielsen-Norman group that they recommend, for example, where it's a really large project. And again, I'll show you some of these examples. In all of these cases, in all of the cases of both the purpose and the value proposition, and the audience, and making an output like a user persona or a user scenario or an audience statement, or having done research and then had findings and results. Most of the time, like some of the reason why you do that is to have an understanding, for you to get an understanding of what's happened. But the other half of the time, it's about documentation and having proof to your client of what you found and that you can refer back to later. So if a client, as a really dumb example, says, we need a map, and then your audience research says that you don't need a map, and at the end, or during the process, your client still insists that you need a map, you say, no. All of these users, none of them mentioned a map, so we don't need a map. That's a really simple thing. So it becomes documentation, proof and validation of what people actually need that you can prove back to your client, but also your understanding of what a project should be. Then the data side, which is this whole other bit, also has a few levels. So often we split this into three. So getting to know the data, where we go, okay, what format is it in? I don't think I have more slides for this. More like what format, how often does it get updated? The really, really basic things that you can cover in a client kickoff meeting. Then you've got comprehending the data, which is what a data analyst typically does. You go in and you go, okay, what are the trends? What are the columns? What are the relationships between things? What are the big and small values? All of those kind of things. But that doesn't really tell you much about what you want to make. That's where the third step comes in. And the third step needs to emerge while or after you're doing the purpose and audience. So when you know someone needs to have like their metrics or their targets, then you can connect what you know about the data with what you know about the audience and what they need and the purpose of why you're making it. And then you can, what we call, narrate the data. So almost tell a story around the data and go, okay, we need to do this first. This is the highest priority. Then there are all of these other things that are kind of next priority and so forth. And actually tell a story and tell that flow through what you're doing with the data. I could get into that in more detail, but that's kind of the gist of the framework. So I wanted to tell you this overarching framework, not because I think you should use it or anything like that. It's just, and it's very, very kind of detailed. But it gives you an idea of how we structure the case studies and how I'm showing you those. So I'll pause for now. Before I get into case studies, does anyone have, is there anything online, or does anyone have any questions at this point? Yes.
So you mentioned at the beginning that you refer to yourself as a data visualization expert, and then I feel like a lot of what you've been talking about, there has been elements of visualization, but that almost feels like just the way in which you communicate the insights and the narrative that are discovered. So I wanted to ask, to what extent do you feel like your job is specifically about visualization versus more generally understanding and interpreting the problem?
So the question is, how much of the job is actually about the specifics of visualization versus the general interpretation and understanding of the problem, which is a really good question. To be honest, it feels like the general stuff is probably, actually, maybe half-half. Let's just call it half-half. So I think that when you have done something for as long as we have, there are certain shortcuts to things that you just don't realize that you do, that if someone who was slightly less experienced or was starting out, they just don't know that. For example, we use lots of different tools. Like we don't use all of these heavy enterprise tools because we're just a small business. So what we end up doing is we leverage all of the different tools that are available out there, from open source things to ones that are like really, really cheap. And so now when we sit down and someone says, can you open this shape file, like this map geospatial file, it's really easy for us. You know, we go to this thing, and it takes us like 5-10 minutes to do. But if someone didn't know what they were doing, we're like, oh, I got a geospatial file from a client and I need to open it and do stuff to it. It's like, it might take them a bit longer. So I think that the expertise that we have doing specifically data visualization, probably contributes to half of the process of what we do and the knowledge in us producing actual work, and I'll show you that. And then the other half is, like you said, this bit, the understanding where you get to a point. There's this thing called a double diamond that you might have seen. And I think you might have, hi. So the idea that, I'll just look this up for you because it makes more sense if I, so the double diamond framework, and I think it looks something like this. Maybe I'll give you an idea version, which I can't find. Oh, this one, okay. No, sorry, now I'm just faffing about. So the idea to double diamond is that you, oh God. Okay, that when you start with something, you need to open up your ideas. So you're opening up ideas, you're learning about the problem space, you're going, oh, I wonder what this is, because you start from this really minuscule problem that someone is trying to ask you to solve, and you need to open up the possibilities, right? At this point, that's the general bit that you're talking about. You know, anyone can kind of do this bit of exploring and research. It might not be as directed as you would like if you were like less experienced, but that's the bit there, opening. The closing bit is where the specialization comes in. Because then you go, oh, okay, I've seen that problem before. That creates a smaller set of solutions in my problem space. I've seen that before, I know how to do that, I've done that before, and it gets smaller and smaller. And where you start to find solutions is where you apply your own learning. And that's where your expertise and and all your experience and all of your knowledge comes in. You can ignore the double diamond bit for now because I don't know how to explain that, but I know the single diamond at least. Any other questions at this point? Okay. So I'll show you some case studies, a few of them. The first one is for UNS. No, it's not. It's for UNICEF. So UNICEF is the United Nations International Children's Economic Fund, but I think they changed the name. So what they wanted to do was that, before I go over there, so they're split up into regional offices, and we were working with the Middle East and North Africa regional office, which covers 14 areas around that area, and they're based in Jordan. So project management aside and meeting times aside, we worked with that group in order to figure out how they should essentially make a dashboard looking at these metrics they had about children. So the metrics looked a bit like this. They were called regional accelerators, and they're very heavy, very heavy metrics to talk about. But let's talk about the lighter ones like education, social protection for national systems, water, primary healthcare, that kind of thing. And each of them had different data points which told them how well things were going, essentially. So there were lots of different metrics, and you can see that so we use Figma a lot. This is a Figma FigJam, which is like a Miro board or a mural board or a freehand or one of those big whiteboardy things. And so the first thing we did in this project, from a data point of view, if you remember those 3 parts of the framework, was to figure out what we were actually talking about and visualizing, and how we could figure out what the priority of all of these things were. So we ended up pulling everything out. They had this thing which was looking at the difference between outputs, which were, I'm not going to explain it because it's too hard, but they had this thing between outputs and outcomes which they wanted to measure. Some of them were global, some of them higher was better, some of them lower was better, and we did that for all of the different kind of themes or topics that they had. So this was our way of trying to get our head around at least some of the way that they had the data arranged. The actual data itself, and I think I can show you that, is apologies, I forgot to open this beforehand, is these big Excel documents, which were kind of horrible. So this one's okay. We had several data sources. So we had API data sources, which are actually okay. Don't convert. So they looked something like this, a really long, fairly, actually a medium-sized table with lots of different things in it. But we also had more difficult ones, which were these SMQ ones. And they were really, really horrible. So they had, is that it? They had these, we're not even in the, okay. So they had merged columns in places, and it was really long, and a lot of things were blank, and you couldn't figure out like what was what. So we had to kind of tidy that up and figure out, oh, there's some data there. Figure all of that out, and there were typos as well, and so forth. So that was the data, trying to get to know it a little bit. But we could only go so far before we needed to ask questions about who we were making it for and why we were making it, and go to that purpose and audience side of things. So then we created a document in order to reflect our understanding of things. So let's fit to page. We talked about here people and purpose, so the regional office advisors and what they needed to do, and also the CEOs or the country officers. So the country officers are kind of more responsible for what they do in each of their countries and territories, obviously. And the advisors have a more overview kind of what's happening in the whole region. So they can say, oh, this is happening for this area. They kind of had the same problems as this other country who's tackling and grappling with this issue now. Maybe we can take what they've learned and apply it to this other country and those kind of things. So we needed both something where individual countries could go and have a look at their own progress, but also that regional officers could go in and see overall progress and see a little bit of the comparison there. We also needed to figure out when during the year it was updated, and that was more for process and admin than anything else. There's data things, so we just documented all of this so that they knew that we had, we had done this, and we had done all the research in order to understand what we were actually making. There are all these things, data sources, and so forth. So then we got to a point where where this is all confirmed, and they said, yes, seems like you understand what's going on. We had a whole bunch of meetings at that point already, and then we went on to wireframes or sketches. So let's look at this one. So because the team already kind of knew what they wanted, this process was a little bit shortened. So we ended up doing very, very quick, where did it go? Very, very quick, maybe it's this one. No? There it is, wireframes. Very, very quick sets of information architecture, which essentially just went, we knew that we were making a dashboard in Power BI, so what were the views? So there were 4 views, how were they each arranged? What did each of them do? So then this was the next one. And this is where the data narration kind of came in. So in one particular view, we would say, okay, we're going to make a set of things on the page that answer these questions for the audience, because we know who the audience is. For example, how is it doing overall? How are we doing in each accelerator? How is each country doing? And so forth. So by writing these questions down, we knew exactly what we had to answer in each of the sections on the page. By putting them in order, we had it in priority. By putting it in order, we also had a flow. And then by actually writing it down and documenting, we had a way of validating it with the client to say, oh yeah, yes, this is what we want in the summary view. That makes sense. Those are the questions that I want answered. Those are the questions that we think the country officers and the regional officers want answering as well, And we did that for all of those. And so we ended up with a structure for each of the pages, which the client also had their go at as well. So one of the things that you might find with clients is that sometimes they like to give you solutions. So they give you a problem and then they also give you the solution. You're like, you hired me to do my job, and my job is to take your problem and solve it for you, not for you to give me the problem and also solve it yourselves. But sometimes they have ideas about things, and so they'll give you things like sketches. The way you don't get angry at them and be passive aggressive is that you have to kind of reflect what they've shown you back onto them and ask them why they've solved something a particular way. So as a really basic example, a client comes to you and says, that button is great, but can you make it blue instead of red? And you go, okay, I could make it blue, but why do you want to make it blue? And then the answer to that question is what helps you decide what to do next. They might say, the red is too, oh sorry, did I say blue? In any case, they might say that the red is not matching with the brand, or maybe they said that it reminds them of something else, or they say that maybe it makes the button too obvious, or whatever it happens to be. So then you go, okay, well then we haven't constrained our brand colors enough, or you say, let's figure it out, but it might not end up being the color the client wants, or you say, oh, if it's too bright and it's too obvious, then maybe this isn't a primary button action, maybe this is a secondary button action, and we should make it a little bit less obvious then, but maybe it doesn't end up even being a button anymore. Maybe it's a little clicky, linky thing instead. So always when a client comes to you with something like this, you always go, okay, but why did you make it like this? And let me help you get to a point where I can understand the reasoning behind it, and then you do your job and they do theirs. Anyway, so that aside, we end up with things like wireframes. So this is a typical-ish example of what a wireframe might be like. It's mostly about structure. It's not about colors or fonts or anything fancy in terms of visual design. It's usually grayscale. We put in color because it made just a little bit more sense to add a little bit to explain what we were doing. We just made some maps. Like I said before, it's easy for us to find a nice grayscale map, so like we can do that very quickly, and so forth. So we did that. And we get feedback for this type of thing. For this project, we did not have access to users, but we did have stakeholders as a proxy, and we also had kind of demonstration days with the wider group. So our direct client and direct stakeholder would set up meetings with the country offices and the regional office representatives, and we would essentially present this to a group of maybe 10 or 14 people. They would give us feedback during that time, but then also we would have our direct stakeholders give us kind of collated feedback as well, and that's where we got that iterative process going in this case. We had to make changes based on that feedback. We also had to make changes because we knew we were making it in Power BI, so there were certain constraints around what we did. Another note here is that if you know that you need to make it in a certain thing, try not to be constrained too early on about what to do, because then that limits what you do. It's better to start a little bit open. Maybe we can do the dots, maybe we can't do the dots, but then make sure that, and this is where the multidisciplinary for us at least comes to mind, because we might, as a designer, push for the dots because we think that's easier for people to see that they're all individual indicators. But then when we get to the point where we're actually implementing, we say, well, actually Power BI will be really either impossible for us to do that, or really difficult, or too custom for us to do that. Then we need to know the intricacies of how technically it would work in order to actually get the client what they want. So that's where that balance comes in. And then we did, so that was wireframes. Then we got to a process of design. Design, you can see some iterations. I'm showing you like really rough things at the moment. So we did change the order of what we were doing a little bit. We had a data issue, so we had to change the way that we were doing those red and green things, but we did have some of them here. They did like the traffic lights. So this is not colorblind accessible for people who are colorblind. Like the red and the green are not different enough, but the client wanted it, so because they were used to it, because the people were familiar with it, which is fair enough, so we just left it. And then we also had a section about, which is not here, also a section about data availability, to actually tell them about, not all of the countries have all of the data, and so forth. And then we implemented the thing in Power BI, which was a lot of work, and I'll show you some of that. So we ended up training them on how to use the Power BI. That included telling them about the workflow, sorry, this is a bit small, what the data sets were that went in as well, all of their settings, and so we handed all of this over 2 or 3 3-hour training sessions for them to figure all of this out, so that they could essentially do this on their own and manage it all on their own as well. There are lots of data transformation bits, and I'm also showing you this to show you that the technical side as well. Then there are projects that are slightly different. So this one was very specific in terms of it being, one, it was a client who was far away, in completely different time zones, where mostly the client was a proxy to the audience. In other cases, we work very, very closely with users. And so I'll show you a design sprint, which again, you may have heard of before. Design sprints? Have you heard of design sprints? So this is a Google started idea where you run a design sprint in 5 days. We did run this in 5 days, and we ran, I think, 7 of them during this project. This was for federal government. I'll just show you what we made. APS career, there it is. Sorry, this is let's try and go to the final one. So this is a way of getting people who are in the public service, in the federal level public service, to consider staying in the public service for longer by planning their career, by putting in skills, by figuring out, I have these certain skills, I can become a senior software engineer if I do this extra training, or actually I want to change completely and be a UX designer and do this kind of thing. So it gives people a chance to look at what the skills needed are for each role and figure it out from there. So this project was a bit different because we were the second vendor to work on it, or the second company to work on it, and so it already had a design, it had already been alpha launched, but at the same time there was a really good agile manager on the project. We had a whole list of user stories. It was an immense project. So we actually started the project with 41 user stories that had actually been defined, and part of the process of us responding to the brief was to say, how much of these 41 do you think you can do? Prove to us that you can do this by showing us how you've planned this agile process, how long you think each thing will take, and also from a general level, but also prove to us one of the user stories and take us through the process of how you would manage that one user story. So it was an extremely, extremely iterative, agile, with a capital A, project. And like I said, was founded mostly in design sprints. And I'll show you what one of them looked like. So this is version A. But let's just do this, okay. This is what 1 week's worth of work is. And there's more. And we had 3 people on our side on the project during a design sprint. So there was me working as kind of director, kind of technical director, and making sure that everything kind of went, and also as a participant. We had our design practice lead at the time, Steph, who was essentially the lead. So she would be managing kind of the day-to-day and everything that was going on. And she would be more concentrated on user interviews, making sure the user research side was robust. And I think she did most of the interviews. And then we had Dasha, who was our UX UI designer and also database specialist. And she would be working as well as a participant as in everything, where she would be concentrating on the prototypes and the UX, the actual UI that was being designed. On the client side, we had our 2 stakeholders, and then we also had, so many people. A couple of experts at the beginning, so people that we would bring in who were also on client side to give us a little bit more extra guidance. And then we had the 5 users on a Friday who we would collect from recruitment via the stakeholders to be involved with all of the process as well. It was very exhausting. It was a very exhausting 12 weeks. So to show you what that looked like in actual specific terms, what we would do is that we would, so on day 1, you essentially figure out what you're doing. So you get your client to tell you what the brief is essentially. This is we picked one of the user stories essentially, or maybe they were kind of epics, they were rather big. We would map out what we were going to do. So in a really, really basic like user flow, figure out what the logic might be and what our end goal was, and kind of plan and ask the client and our experts as well, is this the right gist of things? Is this kind of where we're going? And they would say yes or no, and that would kind of be the end of day 1. Day 2 was about what was called lightning demos. So we would go, okay, now that we know what we're trying to solve it for, let's get some inspiration from other places. So each of us would give one or many examples of the things that we thought were related. And this is where knowing what's out there in the world is important, and finding, you might hear it as discovery or comparative analysis or precedent studies, that kind of thing is important because it helps you to find the patterns that happen in the real world. The number of times we use Airbnb as the pattern is more than I would like to think. So in this case, there was Fitbit. This was Etsy and me showing people what my Etsy page looked like. Uniqlo and so forth, and then we would get the client to show us some as well, and we would make note of and do presentations to each other about what we thought was borrowable from each of these examples and what we thought was not interesting maybe. That gave everyone an idea of where we were kind of at in terms of all of our thinking, and this included the client. The client was always involved with these days. Then immediately after that, we would go into sketching. So the idea is that everyone who was a participant at that time would draw a sketch and present it as well. So it was extremely intense. And one of the things is that sometimes it's very difficult for a client to do sketches. Like sketching is a very specific skill that people think they don't have when they get older. And there are solutions for that. So for example, you might have warm-up exercises with clients to, you can just get them to draw a map of Australia and label it, or get them to draw a little chart and label it. And so you can have, and there are exercises online you can do. Luckily, our clients were fairly good with this kind of thing. This is not from a client, this is from I think this is Dash's, looking at it. Actually, it might be Steph's. This is probably a client one. So, really rough kind of sketches. Again, after going through all of the sketches, we would know precisely what everyone was thinking in their head, and we would go through and vote. So you would see the dots. We would give the client like 5 dots each, and they would be able to vote on each one. And you can see the big dots as well. And so then what we would do as part of this very, very iterative process is base our UI prototype on that. So where is our, sorry. We also did we updated the flow as well. We did a UI prototype, which I'm not going to show you because that's just Figma and like clicking around on an interface. But at the same time, we had to do, you might actually see some of this. So according to the flow that we defined on day 1, that we iterated on in day 2, we would make a full flow through Figma with every single user flow or user journey thing, and everything would get a screen. And this was the pretty intense bit. So a lot of work for Dasha. At the same time, Steph would do one of these, so a little user interview table. So again, making sure that everything that we said we would test is tested, but also that everything on the screen everything that we need to test is on the screen, and everything that's on the screen that is like extra we don't have to confuse the user. And so we needed a really, really specific interview flow going through all of that. And then we would do the interviews. And doing interviews was always with 2 people. So there would be the main interviewer who would sit and these are not the notes from the interview, but we would go through and there would be like a Word doc kind of thing. We would have the questions. I can show you an example. Interview. This is for a different project that I did maybe like 2 months ago. So you can see on the left-hand side, I have the question. On the right-hand side, there's the response. And as an interviewer, it's sometimes really hard because people talk too much, or they don't talk enough, or sometimes they get distracted, or they don't answer the question properly, or they answer a different thing, or they answer a question that you have later, or whatever it happens to be. So you have to be really on your toes when it comes to being an interviewer. So we did 5 of these at the end of this process, and then summarize all of them. And then decide, okay, based on that, what changes do we need to make? So here's the outcomes. Here are the key screens. Here's what we found. We went for prototype B versus prototype A, or we borrowed some things from B and there are some things from A. These are the outcomes. This is what we're going to do off the back of the outcomes. And we did this 7 times. And we ended up, having, out of all of that output, we also had to do a final round of designs. So because this was very fast-paced, as you can imagine, going through a whole design sprint for 5 days, we needed to take a rest and then actually do proper design work at the end. And then after that, we had a proper development cycle as well. So picking everything that we had done in terms of changes, documenting all of that, and it might look something like like we used to use Bug Herd for that, or we might end up with something like, this is a different project, where we would have feedback and get the client on board in terms of, okay, we're going to do that or we're not going to do it, or whatever comments there are. So getting actual feedback from the client. Again, this is a little bit out of context because it's a different project. I wanted to show you 3, but I'm only going to show you 2 because we're going to run out of time. I'm going to sneeze as well. I will sneeze at some point. Okay. Very, very quickly, or maybe not. Maybe this is too much. No, let's just skip this. So, were there any questions about the case studies, firstly?
Did the client often give you like ample time to do it nicely and have it well presented, or was there often a lot of time pressure with these projects?
The question is whether there was a lot of time pressure with these projects. It was like a curve, right? A distribution curve. So sometimes it was, can you please do this in 4 weeks during COVID while we're all remote and we've never met each other in real life? And we're going to go live at the end of 4 weeks. But sometimes, and more often than not, it was we have ample time, and we're lucky enough that the type of people the type of clients that we work with, government being a big offender, is that they tend to push out deadlines instead of bringing them in. So we have learned over time that in order to not have pressure on the team and on ourselves, that we shouldn't do as many commercial projects or marketing-y kind of based ones, and instead we concentrate on universities and government and those kind of places because it tends to be more relaxed. And then also the other good thing is that usually it's for good, usually it's something that's multi-use and so forth, but usually the time pressure is okay for the most part. Yeah. Any other questions about case studies? Anything online? How long do things take to produce? So on average, I would say 4 months, but there are some projects which are longer. So this one that I just showed you with the multiple design sprints was probably a 6-month project end to end. UNICEF, not this one, this UNICEF one was, maybe 3 months, I think. But this was just Jack and I as a really, really small team. But for the size that we were and are, a 3-month project is kind of now average, I think. Yeah. Any other questions about case studies? Okay. You can ask later as well. So the last thing I wanted to talk about, and Dr. Jiang didn't ask me to do this, but I thought this might be helpful. So getting hired and working as a team. So over the 13 years that we existed as Small Multiples, we had a lot of people on the team. I think we had a pretty good culture. Like we went on a retreat every year. We did that 5 times. We had a few people stay quite long as well. So we ended up with, I have a graph as well. So in our peak, 15, and then we went to Accenture. Again, I can talk about that later too. And now we're 2. And we always had more developers than any other type of role. We never had any data scientists, interestingly enough, even though we're a data viz specialization company. But it was mainly developers and designers and a couple of PMs along the way. And for developers, I think we probably hired 15, and I had a hand at hiring 15 of them over the time who had stayed longer than a certain amount of time. I also had my hand at firing a bunch as well. But in terms of, I had notes for this. I want to show you the notes because, Okay, so yeah, with the developers, a lot of them, so people who left in terms of developers were mainly because we were essentially an agency. I don't like to call ourselves an agency, but we were effectively. And so that meant that the type of work was quite one-off in terms of like, you do a project, you come in, you do a project, it's done, you don't do maintenance on it, you don't do further development on it, it kind of just goes away. And yes, the client might work on it, might use it over time, but as a developer, you only get it for that 3 months, that 4 months. And then you go away and you do the next thing, which is good from a learning perspective. So maybe when you're starting out, go to an agency. You learn lots of different things, you learn lots of different tools, you develop a sense of repeating things and so forth. But at some point, it feels like most developers get the itchy thing and they go, no, I want to work on a thing for a long time. So they end up going to product companies. So that's what happened for most of the developers who left us. Like they quit rather than us letting them go. So that's what happened there. But we had developers who would stay with us, like one of them for 5 years, a couple of them for 4, 1 or 2 for 3, and so forth. So insights in terms of getting hired. So I'm making an assumption that maybe I should ask, what kind of jobs do you want when you graduate? You're mostly at the end of first year, is that right? Yeah, so what are you hoping to get out of the degree? Anyone want to volunteer? Like, what roles are you looking for once you graduate? Just shout it out.
Something practical.
Yeah.
Not sitting in front of a computer.
Not sitting in front of the computer, okay. So maybe like hardware-based or being out in field.
Yeah, well, I mean, stuff like this seems pretty interesting. There's a lot of like client interaction and
Yep.
brainstorming that and not just typing out numbers all day.
Yeah, so someone's like maybe a balanced one, maybe something a bit more client-facing. Anyone else? Okay, let's go the other way. How many people are looking to get like an engineering role of some sort? Put your hand up. Oh, what is everyone else doing then? What are other roles that are people looking to? The 2 ladies here. What kind of roles do you think? You don't know yet? Okay, all right. Well, because I don't want to assume too much about what you're going to do next, but these tips are written in a presumptuous kind of way, so just that caveat. All right, just FYI. So usually the things that people are looking for you, especially with developers, because the environment moves so quickly, is someone who's always seeking learning and seeking improvement. So the proof of that is that you go to meetups, that you know the latest technology, that maybe you have a side project that you do on the weekends. And I'm not saying that you have to do this, it just happens that if you already do it, great, people will recognize that. If you want an edge and you're willing to do it, go and do it. But if this is not your type of thing, then yeah, there are other ways, obviously, to show how awesome you are and how much you want to work for someone. Being a little bit biased here, but I appreciate people who are a bit multidisciplinary. So it's good to have a developer who's very good at doing development, but it's better to have a developer who is also interested in design, interested in hearing what designers have to talk about, interested in learning about the process and learning about new things and learning more skills than just development. And the final one is kind of related, which is to have someone who can manage their own time, so that you shouldn't be sitting, you could be, but you shouldn't be sitting in an office or somewhere else or at home or remote working, having someone tell you what to do with your time. You should be able to figure that out on your own. That's really good, especially in terms of remote working, but also as part of the team, that instead of your manager saying, hey, you've got 2 days left on this project or on this sprint, how are you going with things? You can say to them, hey, I have 2 days left on this sprint and I'm kind of finished, or I have 2 days left, but I think I need more time because this other thing that I was working with a designer, it went a little bit over and we realized that we don't have enough time, can you help me out? People who are proactive with their time and time management and things like that is really, really helpful. So that's the things that a company would look for in you. But what you should look for in a company is someone you can learn from. So going into a company which has like a junior, oh no, sorry, I shouldn't say. So someone who going into a company where there are less people or where there are less senior people is at a disadvantage. You don't necessarily want to be a graduate or a junior lumped in with a whole bunch of other juniors because yes, there'll be differences in your skill level and your experience and knowledge, but you don't have that someone who's more mature than you to kind of guide you all. So you really want to make sure that once you join a team that you have a mid or senior person who you can lean on. You want to see that people are happy. This is a really weird one, not weird, but like you should see like that people are a cultural fit. And the final thing is to keep an open mind. So I think a lot of people, especially seeing sometimes grad developers go, oh, the big ones, Atlassian, Alphabet, Domain, Telstra, Optus, whatever happens to be, and they think that they need to go into those big companies to do good work or to learn. You're going to also learn heaps from a very, very small company who has specializations like us, for example. Although we're not hiring, we're happy at 2 right now. But I think what people benefited from being at small multiples is that we were small, we were really flexible with things, we didn't make people work, super long hours, we didn't have all the bureaucracy, and people got to work on lots of different projects as well. You can see how wide-ranging just 2 projects were. But there are going to be some companies which they kind of look maybe older or they look small, but maybe the team is really good and maybe you're working on really interesting projects. So keep an open mind when you eventually, or you are already looking at roles. I'm not going to talk about this, and I think that's it. Yeah. If there are any questions on anything like process, case studies, finding a job, Accenture, all of those.
Yeah. You mentioned that you had to fire some people.
Yes.
So what criteria would justify firing?
Okay, so how official does this need to be? Like, how on the internet is this?
It's public on the internet.
No, but does it like get? Is it archived on the internet? Like it's.
No.
It's just live right now.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So.
We will have a recording in there, but I'm happy to cut that off later.
Okay, cut it off then. So as a small business, because we're tiny, it's fairly easy for us to make people redundant because we're just so small that that sometimes there's just a bit of churn and that's what happens, unfortunately. So most of the people who were fired were made redundant because we don't need their roles anymore. But how you not get fired is you do these things, these yellow things. So you be a happy member of the team, and you collaborate with others and listen to others and don't do your own thing. You be an open thing. Like obviously if you're older and more experienced and you have that knowledge to give, you give it, but you don't force people down a particular road. You have to be open to your team members. Other ways that you might not get fired are that you manage your time and be very open with your manager and your team members about how things are going. So instead of going, I've just got to finish this thing and like not communicate during the whole week during a sprint, instead you go, hey, okay, Tuesday morning, I had that problem on Monday, I solved it, it's good, I got more time, give me more work, or like I said before, I'm struggling with this, I need help. Can you give it to me? And that's like Tuesday afternoon, and then you have the next 3 days to work. Those are the main things, and you got to be a team player really. It depends how the culture of the office is at different places. But for us, I think because we were small, we needed a very collaborative, open kind of mindset for people.
So at least for your company where you spent so much time dealing with the client, if you're hiring someone, would you go for someone more with just general good people skills over like technical
No.
skills?
So the question is whether I would go for someone with more general skills rather than technical skills. No, because we have people who do that. So if we go back to this one, like myself, you can see I'm a talky one, even though I have hard skills, I also have this, hopefully I have these soft skills. Jack is the same, he has his soft skills. One of the things he realized when we were at Accenture is he usually left the talking to myself and our general manager, Anne-Marie, and he realized when he got to Accenture that he was also really good at bullshitting. So sometimes you need to do this thing with the client and make them feel happy, but there's a certain type of person who does that. Okay, rewind a little bit. A typical project is director, general manager, / project manager, depending on who's busy at the time. UX designer, so the user researchery type person. UI designer, who does the wires and the visual, for example. Although UX does wires as well. And then one to multiple developers. That's usually what happens. And so this general kind of client liaison-y side is usually taken care of by project manager and director. Everyone else is brought in at a very, very early stage to make sure that usually the average is 5 of us are all on the same page and all know what's going on, and we don't, for example, we don't need to tell the developer until we get to the design stage and then chuck it over the fence and let the developer deal with it. We bring everyone together at the very beginning. And you want people who are really good at what they do and specialists. So developers who are really good at React, and it's on your computer, and JavaScript and Node and whatever it happens to be. You actually, in the case of developers and UX UI designers, you want people who are deep specialists, with the bonus of if they can manage their own time. And be good team people, then that's a bonus.
So when you were at your peak, 15 developers, only a handful of those people would be interacting with the client on a day-to-day basis, and the others would be working in the back end?
Yeah, it depends. So the question is about whether at our peak developers and designers would also be client-facing. They would when it was necessary, so we would try and usually shield the team from from stakeholders, because stakeholders sometimes you need to know how to interpret what they're saying a particular way. So Anne-Marie and I, for example, would act, and Jack would act as a little bit of a translation or interpreter at that stage. So some of it was about protection, but sometimes when developers were really deep into a project, or there were also very skilled people on the client end, and it wasn't about manager to manager, it was more about technician to technician, then yes, absolutely, then developers and designers would be involved. Yeah. Any other questions?
This is a question about interviews. So we hire a developer. Obviously, you would interview, test them, get an idea of what their knowledge is, and so on and so forth. What would you consider as if I want to apply for a job, is too much for interviews? Some interviews would be you'd have to come to our offices 4 times, you have to do a couple of tests and work. So what would be a limit that I should stop?
The question is about when is an interview process too long? It depends on the company. So for us, it might be maybe 1 hour with the general manager and myself, and then another hour a week later, if we like them, with the development team, something like that. But say you go to Atlassian or Alphabet, they have they have lots of people applying, and 2, they have extremely high standards. So if they're going to put you through a week-long, test a day and then a submission at the end and a 4-hour interview, then you kind of got to do it if you're going to do it. If you really want to roll, then the interview process is part of that, journey that you got to take. So there's no answer, as long as it takes.
A friend of mine works for AWS, and that was a 5-stage interview process.
Yeah.
So
Sorry, that's the wrong answer you were looking for, probably.
Yeah, it is what it is.
Any other questions? Anything online? Okay, cool. All right, all good.
Thank you so much. Wow, I learned a lot. I hope you also learned a lot. So that's all for our guest lecture. Let's take a 10 minutes break and come back for our normal 1531 lecture. If you have any questions that you do not want to ask like publicly here, you can also come here to ask questions. So 10 minutes, I'll come back to the lecture at 12:25. Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, where's my bag? I actually have a gift for guest lecture.
Oh, thank you.
Oh, where's my bag?
It's
Oh,
here.
it's here. Here are something from AI Institute and
cool.
School of Computer Science and Engineering. So some
Ooh.
mugs, notebooks, hats, and stuff.
Oh, merch! Swag! Awesome!
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, stuff. Put it. Okay. So they cannot
I will see you around the neighborhood.
Okay, oh, is that too loud? Is that okay? Okay. Great to see everyone again. I feel like I haven't seen you for ages. So it's so nice to see you guys again. So today's lecture is about requirements. So requirements and requirement engineering. So this is the last part that you will need to know for your iterations, right? So we'll talk about what is requirement engineering, what is requirements, what are requirements, what is requirement engineering, and how you can do, like as Andrea mentioned, like user story, user cases, and how to verify those, how to validate those. So this is part of your iteration thread. Okay, it's a little bit weird on my laptop. Okay, so before we talk about what is requirements, can you have a guess, like what is your understanding about requirements? Yeah. What clients want for their projects? Good answer. Any other thoughts? Yeah. Yeah, that's like part of the answer, part of the correct answer. So the requirements is about what the stakeholders need for the product. So stakeholders include clients, but not just clients. So stakeholders also include the users. So the clients may not be the users, right? So for example, a company like Lecture1 wants you to do something, but Lecture1 is not using that. Their user will use that product, right? So stakeholders include both clients and users, and maybe other people involved in the process. For example, designers is also stakeholders. Developers yourself is also a stakeholder. So requirements is understanding the stakeholders' needs for the product. Okay. And this is actually the most important part of building a system, is to figure out what to build. Okay. So before we code anything, we need to know how to test that. So we have learned that, like testing before coding, right? And before we code anything, like before we test anything, we also need to do how to design it. And to be able to test and to be able to design anything, we need to know our objective. What is our objective? Like, what is the purpose of this product? With this product, what our stakeholders can achieve? Like, what our clients can do, what our users can do, right? So these are requirements. So by definition, a requirement is a condition or capability needed by a user to solve a problem or achieve an objective. And we will also describe requirements as agreement of work to be completed by all stakeholders, right? And description constraints of a proposed system. Okay, so here are two terms, like descriptions and constraints. So there are two parts of requirements. Descriptions of what this product can do, and also the constraints on this product. The constraints maybe the product is easy to use. Okay, it needs to be finish something before like 10 seconds or 1 day. So these are constraints. So there are two parts of requirements, descriptions and constraints. And they are described as functional and non-functional requirements. So functional requirements describe a specific capability that your product can achieve. For example, after I press this button, it turns to the next slide. Okay, so this is something that the product can do. It is functional. And non-functional is like description of it. For example, after I click on this button, within 2 seconds, it's turned to the next slide. So functional and non-functional requirement. And both are very important part of requirement. These are some more examples. Functional requirement. The system must send a notification to all users when, can you hear us? Sorry. Yeah, they can hear us, perfect. Yeah, okay. So the system must send a notification to all users when there's a new post or someone comments on an existing post. For non-functional requirements, is the system must send emails to no later than 30 minutes after from such an activity. So this is constraint called non-functional requirements. And this kind of requirement doesn't come from out of blue, right? There needs to be a way to identify those requirements. How do we identify those? Interviews, surveys, right? And also talking with people. So these are the ways of identifying those requirements. And the process is called requirement engineering. So when you heard people say requirement engineering, it's the process of identifying and consolidating those kind of requirements. And there are 4 steps. So like with different companies or different people, we may have different process of identifying those requirements. But these 4 steps are quite like common way of identifying requirements. The first is called elicitation. It's just interview, surveys, talking with people. Analysis is after you have done those interview, survey, talking with people, you analyze those data. Okay? And then specification is written down those requirements as a spec, like your project spec. It's something written down after the first 2 steps. And the last step is to validate. So after you have all the spec, you need to validate that. Okay, let's go through them one by one. Okay, so this is another more detailed explanation of requirement engineering. So it's just a set of activities to identify the purpose and goal of a software system. And stakeholders include end users, who are using the system, the clients, who pay you to do the system, and also the design team. So they are the stakeholders, and all of them are important in identifying the requirements. And the steps are here. The step 1 is raise your hand, ask questions, talk with people, right? Interview with stakeholders. So you interview with all of them, so not just client. Remember that when you are given a job with a client, not only talk with them, you need to talk with the people who you also need to talk with people who actually use it, and also the design team. Focus group. Focus group is very similar to do interviews with stakeholders, but the difference is doing interviews is more often one-on-one. So one interviewer, one interviewee. But for focus group, you bring a group of people together. Maybe include developer, designer, client, user, and also the people who are doing the interview. It's a group of people coming together. And maybe also the experts, the field experts in the area. So this is a focus group. And the question you may ask is what if? Or what is it? So for example, you are designing or developing a new to-do app, or to-do app. You may ask, what if your app can now do something different, like this or that? Okay, so what if you have a to-do app that can blah, 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 blah. And you may also ask a lot of questions like why? Why you are doing things in this particular way? Or maybe your stakeholder raise a problem, like a challenge they have with their current to-do app. You ask questions like why? So often we want to dig deeper in our questions. So, yeah. And the next step is analysis. So after you have done all the interviews, focus group, market research, talking with experts, you have all of this data. Okay. Now what you are going to do is to analyze those data. Identify the dependencies, whether there's any conflicts, like the clients want you to do this, but the users want something different. So then you need to do some analysis, like why the clients want the app or the system to be in this way, and why the users want to be in another way. Right? So you analyze those data, but without making any decisions at this stage. Just analyze that. Analyze anything from the data. And establish relative priorities. Like they may ask a lot of things for your to-do app, and you cannot do all of them at once, right? So the next step is prioritize those tasks, right, based on data. Again, so all of decisions in this requirement engineering process needs to be evidence-based. So everything needs to be from data. Maybe it's from the stakeholders, maybe it's from like research, maybe it's from literature, maybe it's from experts, but it needs to be evidence-based. And usually this can be done through two ways, like user stories or use cases. I will try if I can cover those today, but if not, we'll make sure to mention those in the Wednesday lecture. And the next step is analysis. So after you have done all the interviews, focus group, market research, talking with experts, you have all of this data. So after you have done the analysis, the next step is to have a spec, like your project spec. This is the stage where you break the requirements into functional or non-functional requirements. So you kind of write things down. Okay, so you write something like the system shall do this, the system should like make sure follow those constraints or something like that. So this is your spec. So after you have done analysis, you write everything down. And then validation. So validation is very, very important. So validation is the process, like you go back to stakeholders and make sure that those requirements are correct. Why? Like, can you guess why we need this step?
Make sure you're on the right track.
To make sure that we are on the right track, exactly. Because in many cases, not only the clients, but also the users, they do not know what they want. Okay, so they do not know what they want. So they may talk with you like, this is the problem that I'm facing, or that is the problem I'm facing, but they do not know what they actually want. So after you have done all those interviews, those analysis, and then we need to go back to them and say, is this problem is important for you to solve? If I propose some solution, like, not solution like this, but if I solve this problem, do you think it's beneficial for you? So go back to those stakeholders, confirm with them before you design the system or like make any coding or development. Otherwise, if you misunderstood those requirements and you start very early with coding, with solution, you may find that you develop something that cannot solve users' problem. It's kind of waste of time, waste of resources, waste of money. Right? So before you code anything, make sure that you are solving the correct problem, the right problem. And there are a bunch of challenges during requirement engineering. It is not an easy process. Requirement engineering is not easy. It's pretty challenging, and there are some things that bring those challenges in. Like requirements sometimes can only be understood after design of your process began. So this is very common. And it is also common that during your design develop process, like new requirements come in or requirement changes because people are changing. Like they want something different during the process. And then it's like they do not know what they want. This is very, very common. And they change their mind. So when you're working with actual people, working with clients, these are pretty common. And also another challenge is developers might not understand the subject domain. Like for example, they are developing some clinical system, like for clinics, for medical people to use. They may have no idea like how this domain works. So this is why, like Andrea mentioned, that they want to bring those developers in as early as possible. Right, so before the development stage, even before the design stage, like they want to bring those developers in as early as possible so that they can understand the domain better, and also understand the clients and the stakeholders better. And limited access to stakeholders. Like we mentioned that we want you to do interviews, we want to do surveys, but what if we can't have access to those stakeholders, like the potential users? Like Andrea mentioned in the first use cases, like their users are in South Africa. And it was during COVID, so they have no access to the potential user. So this is a very common challenge as well. So in this case, we may work with the client who communicate with you rather than the actual users. And the client may work with the end users. And jumping into details of solution too early. Wow, this is so common. It's not a challenge, I would say it's a mistake. Like we should not jump into solutions too early before we validate our requirements. But this is very common, especially like Andrea also mentioned this. Like especially when we work with clients, the clients will bring solution in before actually doing the requirement engineering process. So the solution may not solve the correct problem. Okay, so this is where you need to communicate properly with the client. Make sure that they understand the importance of requirement engineering. make sure that we need to validate the requirements before we come into like any solutions, because we need to know the problem first. If we do not have a good understanding of what is the problem, how does the solution come in, right? The solution is to solve the right problem. Yay, so this is a very quick lecture introducing to you what is requirement engineering, and how is the process. And now we'll introduce use cases and user stories, which are important tools for us in the requirement engineering process. Okay, so these are tools for requirement engineering process. And requirements can be very, very human and express complex flows. We need a way to model this. Like model this in a way like it's easier to communicate, easier to understand, not only for people who are doing the interview, but also for other people, other stakeholders, like the designers, the developers. So we need to model the requirements in a way like the stakeholders can all understand what needs to be solved, what is the problem. Right? So this is where we bring in like user story or user cases. So first of all, the user stories. So for your iteration 3, you're also going to write some user stories. So user stories are a method of requirement engineering used to inform the development process and what features to build with the user at the center. So remember, like whatever system you are building for the user to use it. Right? So this is also a very popular concepts now in software engineering and in like other areas. So we need to have user at the center of our design, development, and all the software engineering life cycle. And this is often like ignored. So we jump to solution too fast. Like we want to have a button here, like we want to have feature there, here, or there, but we forgot to put a user in the center. So this is something that we need to make sure that we pay attention to. Okay, so what are user stories? What is a user story? So user story is in this kind of format. It's pretty easy. Like when a customer tells you what they want, try to express it in a way like, as a type of user, I want to do something so that I can achieve something. Okay, so this is like this kind of format, this kind of structure kind of force you to put a user at the center. For example, you can say like a customer or a user or stakeholder may say like a student can purchase monthly parking passes online. So this is something like a feature, something the system can enable the user to do, but it didn't put a user at the center. But when we put a user at the center and following the structure of user stories, it becomes, as a student, I want to purchase a parking pass so that I can drive to school. Right? So it's very clear what kind of user this user story is for, what they can do. Right? They can purchase a parking ticket. Why do they want to have a parking pass? Because they want to drive to school. So this is the structure of user stories. Right? So why we have like as a type of user, why we don't say like as a user I want to do something. So why we should say like as a student I can do something. Why? It's because we may have different type of users on our system, right? So for example, on the forum, so I mean, you may say like, as a student, I can ask questions, right? But as a tutor, the feature should be different. It should be, I can reply to students' questions, okay? As an admin, it's different again, right? As an admin, I can pin a post. I can email to students. Right, so this is why it is also important to state like what kind of user you are, the user story is about. And then why do we have like so that? So why we just say like as a student, I want to purchase a parking pass and that's it. So why do we need a reason for it?
So it's not a waste of time.
So there are a couple of reasons. So the first one is when you bring these user stories back to the stakeholders, they know where this is coming from, right? And also when you bring this user story to the developer, they also have a good understanding like why I'm developing this feature, right? Because the user stories are used for validating with the stakeholders. Like when you come up with the spec, you bring those user stories back to the stakeholders and validate with them. But it's also used for designers, like when they design the interface, the user interactions, and these user stories are also used by developers. When they develop a feature, when they develop something, they also use these ones. Okay, so you can also see that it's also very easy to understand. There's no technical details at all, right, in these user stories. The reason is because it needs to be understood by the stakeholders, by like everyone on the team, right? Not only the developers, everyone. Right? So it's written in a way that is really easy to understand. Okay, so there are some attributes for user stories. The first one is written in a non-technical language because we need to communicate user stories with the stakeholders who do not understand technical things. Okay, and it's focused on keeping the customer at the core of the experience. I will not actually, I don't think customer is a good term here. We should say the users, like different type of users at the core of the experience, like student, admin, or tutor, right? And they are very goal-oriented, not product feature focused, right? It didn't say like where you can like press this button, you can purchase a parking pass, right? It's not like feature, it's not product finished. It's not product feature focused, but it's user goal-oriented. Right? It's the way that it's telling. So user stories focus on the problem. So make sure that you understand the problem first before you jump into the solution. This is a very, very common mistake. Right? Okay, so do we have time? Maybe just read a few. Like, let's read out some user stories for to-do list. Any volunteer?
User stories about what?
About the to-do list, a to-do list app. As a user, I can add a new to-do item so that I can keep track of my to-do items. What else?
You can add like a delete thing.
Yeah. So as a user, I can, like general user, I can delete my to-do item so that I can keep track of things that I have already done. Yeah. Or as so what I can also add it, right? Maybe I can also add it and make changes. Maybe I also want to add deadlines. Okay, so there are a lot of things we can do with to-do list. Yep. There are some like when you're writing user stories, is there any way like we can tell whether we are writing good user stories or like not good enough user stories? So there are some criteria that you can use to check your own user stories. The first one is independent. It means that it doesn't depend on other user stories. And it's also negotiable, meaning that we do not want too much detail in that. It just say what is the problem that we want to solve, right? What the users can achieve. It doesn't have any technical details, including how. Right? And it's also valuable. It must hold some value to the client. Right? It needs to solve some of the users' problems. It needs to bring some value to the users. And it should also be estimatable, and we'll cover that in a future lecture. The reason that I want it to be estimatable is because, like Andrea mentioned that they work in sprints. Like in sprints, it's very common, like each sprint solve one user story for one developer. So in your sprints, you may bring a user story to your sprint. Okay, so this is the feature that I will implement in my sprints. So it needs to be estimatable. Well, this user story is not too large. It's not doing a lot of things in one user story. Right? So, okay. So the next one is small, so it's kind of relevant. So your user story should be small. And also testable. Like how can you know whether you have done this user story? Right? So it needs to be testable. Another thing about user story is called user acceptance criteria. So there needs to be some criteria to measure, well, you have completed this user story. Right? So this is called user acceptance criteria. So for example, now I have a user story as a user, I want to use a search field to type a city, name, or street so that I can find matching hotel options. And the user acceptance criteria becomes the search field is placed on the top bar. The search starts once the user clicks on search. So you can see that the difference, right? With user stories, just the problem, right? The problem, the value we are bringing to the user. But when we come to user acceptance criteria, the solution comes in now. Right? So you need to verify or validate your user stories first before you jump into like user acceptance criteria, like more details, or more like details on the features and stuff. So this is called rule-based user acceptance criteria. So these are the rules for this, the rules of this criteria for this user story. Like the placeholder disappears once the user starts typing. Search is performed if a user types in a city, hotel name, street, or all combined. The user can't type more than like 200 symbols. So these are rule-based user acceptance criteria. There are another example, like as a user, I can log in through a social media account because I always forget my password. And the user acceptance criteria becomes like more details, can log in through Facebook, can log in through LinkedIn, can log in through Twitter. Okay, so at the end of your sprint, you can use those to check, right? If you only can log in using like Facebook account, so it means that you haven't done this user story. Right? The user should also be able to log in through LinkedIn and Twitter. And there are also some like user acceptance criteria, like how do you know whether you have a good user acceptance criteria? It shouldn't be too broad, but not too narrow. It should be able to finish in one sprint. Well, it's hard to measure or estimate for you at the beginning, but gradually you will have like a good understanding, like what is the size like of a good user acceptance criteria or user story that you can finish in one sprint. Minimize technical details. Okay, so when you have a look at this example, although it has something about the feature, like how, but still it's not very technical, right? It doesn't say, well, please use JavaScript, use React, use whatever, right? It doesn't have too much technical details, but as you can see that it said minimize technical details. It's different from user stories. User stories said no technical details. Right? But for user acceptance criteria, when you come a little bit towards the solution, you can start to have some technical detail, but again, not too much. Well, they can be updated. During development. They should first be written before it starts. So before we start any of the development process, like any coding, we need to have those already, so that we know what we are coding and we know how we can test, right? How we can rat test. Acceptance tests are tests that can perform to ensure so they are quite trivial. And acceptance tests are black box tests. Black box tests meaning that it doesn't matter how you solve the problem, just you solve the problem and you solve it. It's black box. It's also a black box. Any questions so far?
You hope that you do a bunch of user stories that like some would overlap, right? And then you know that that's a particular issue that you want to face. Like if multiple users ask for the same thing, that's something you want to address. But like I'm sure there are scenarios where you've got a whole nothing overlaps, right? So you then have to prioritize it yourself. Because like if 5 users all want the same feature, then you know that that's something good to implement because a lot of people want it.
Yep.
But if there's no overlap with
Uh-huh.
ideas?
Yeah.
Like, is that prioritization
Well-
something you do?
Good question. The question is for some feature or user stories, if a lot of multiple type of user want this feature, we may want to prioritize this feature, meaning that this feature is potentially useful. But if we do not have this kind of overlap, how can we prioritize the user stories, right? So there are a lot of different ways. For example, so you may do some interviews first with some users, and then you identify some user stories, right? You are not too sure which one to prioritize or how to prioritize. You may use surveys, right? So you list those potential problems, and you can do some, after you have done the survey, like you distribute a survey to a lot of people, and you can do some quantitative analysis. For example, 100 people want this feature, but only 1 people want that problem to be solved. So we might want to prioritize that one, right? And also we may want to prioritize based on, for example, there are some urgency in the field. For example, this system is for like environmental issue or whatever. So you may consult some experts in the field, like which one should we prioritize to be beneficial to the environment and stuff. Yeah. Any other questions? All good so far? Let me check online. We have Golf says target audience. Sorry, I'm not too sure what was your question, but if you can clarify in the chat, that'll be great. Okay, so we mentioned that this kind of user acceptance criteria is called rule-based user acceptance criteria. There's another way of writing user acceptance criteria. It's called scenario-oriented. It's in a typical structure, like given some precondition, when I do some action, then I can expect some result. Okay, so the precondition maybe we have the search button on top, and after I tap in something and I click on the search button, then I can expect some results listed below. So this is called scenario-oriented user acceptance criteria. So this is an example. This is the user story. Says like, as a user, I want to be able to recover the password to my account, so I will be able to access my account in case I forgot my password. Yes, this is a very good written user story. And the user acceptance criteria for this one is the scenario's name is called forgot password. Given the precondition is the user have navigated to the login page, and when the user selected forgot password option and entered a validated email to receive a link for the password recovery, then what happens is the system sent a link to the entered email. And given the user have received the link via the email, when the user navigates through the link received in the email, then the system can enable the user to set a new password. So you can see that there are some ways of combination of the keyword, like when or and or then or given. So you can use those keywords to organize your scenario-oriented user acceptance criteria. It doesn't mean that you can only have scenario, given, when, then, that's it. It's not the case. So you can move it around and arrange it for your purposes. So which one to use? There's no single rule. Sometimes when you use rule-based, it's easier to understand, easier to use. But in other cases, like scenario may be better. But you may want to try with the scenario one first. If it works, that's great, because it's easier to implement, because it has a very logical process, like what the condition and the action and then the results, right? Then is the use cases. Do you have a tutorial at 1 or 1:30? Oh, good. Am I okay to do a bit longer? Do we have another lecture? Okay. Is it okay I spend another 10 minutes? Yeah, to finish use cases. Thank you. So use cases is different from user stories. Okay, but it's somehow similar that it puts, it represents a dialogue between the user and the system. Okay, let's see some examples first. I think that'll be easier. Okay, so this is so use cases can be, yeah, feel free to leave if you have another classes. Otherwise, you can watch the recording afterwards. So use cases can be in the form of a diagram or text, so both works. So for example, let's have a look at this one. So use cases describe how the user interacts with the system. So the user do something, the system react with something, and then the user do something and the system do something. So it's kind of a description of the interactions between the user and the system. For example, in this case, the ATM says enter your PIN. The user pinning the PIN, like typing in a PIN number. Okay, so the computer, so the ATM verify this account and shows, and it communicates with the server, give back like the balances, whatever. And then the ATM asks again, how may I help you? The user say, well, withdraw $60. Okay, please take your cash and collecting cash. And then they communicate with the server again. So it describes the interaction between the user and the system. It can also describe in like a written text rather than a diagram, but it describes very similar thing. It's just the way like we describe that. The step one is ATM ask customer for a PIN. Step two, customer enter the PIN. You can see it's very similar, right? But sometimes we prefer using the diagram because it's easier to understand. Right? Like we have a lot of people that are like graphic minded. It's not the right term, but yeah. So sometimes using graph is easier to understand. But if you can just in a written form, is also okay. Yeah. Yeah, that's it. Perfect. Done. I know I'm a bit rushed about the requirement and requirement engineering phase and user case user studies. So if you need any clarifications, feel free to ask in the next lecture, so Wednesday lecture, and we are very happy to clarify things for you. Thank you, everyone.